Hello and welcome, my loves. This is Freddie, and we are here for our third episode of Women Doing Their Thing. This is pretty exciting for me. I love that I'm hanging in there with doing one episode after the next. I am always responsive to what's ready to emerge, and this is like a pretty appropriate sort of theme for our episode today, because we're going to be looking a little bit at emergence. It's the winter solstice here in the northern hemisphere, a time of transition and opening to the light. And it was a little while ago now that the seed of this podcast began to sort of sprout. It was probably over a year ago. And I have this thing where an idea will come to mind and I will kind of foster it in the shadows for as long as it needs. And then it gets to this point where now it's ready to express in a more sort of, like a more, maybe like a formal 3D kind of plane. So when the podcast was coming about in my mind, of course, first of all, I had all of these thoughts, like, who am I to create a podcast? Blah, 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 all of the, what do we call that? Imposter syndrome stuff. And I just let that pass and kind of wash on by. And then I started thinking about like what the vibe of the podcast would be. And when I'm sort of creating or setting up, maybe I'm doing a workshop or a mini retreat or a gathering of some kind, in the back of my mind, the vibe that I always want to create is like this kind of sense of us sitting around the fire together. That's really what I want to create. That's what I want to welcome you into. I want to create a sense of warmth and welcoming. And so that was the one thing that stayed with me in this sort of journey towards creating a podcast. I would like this to feel like we're sitting around the fire together, like I can be a voice in the background while you're out for a walk in the park, or maybe you're driving somewhere, or, however you listen to podcasts. And one of the things that I wanted to express through recording this was my work. Of course, my work, because I strongly believe that the work that I do really helps shine light on liberation and freedom and new ways of thinking and being in the world. And I have worked in mental health now for about 20 years. And that's been a real journey of discovering what works, what doesn't work, telling the difference between growth and the status quo. There's quite a lot to say about all of those kinds of topics. But more recently, within the last maybe 5-6 years, I discovered an approach called organic intelligence. I am now an organic intelligence coach and educator. And I discovered this approach like 5 or 6 years ago, and it has had a huge impact on my personal and professional lives. And it has kind of induced a great sort of settling in my system and feeling of unity with the work and the direction that I want to move in. So one of the intentions for me behind this podcast is to share organic intelligence with you. But also, the podcast is called Women Doing Their Thing. And one of the reasons why it's called Women Doing Their Thing is because I have grown up surrounded by the most spectacular, incredible, powerful, extraordinary women who live very everyday, ordinary kind of lives, who are just getting on with things. And people tell me their stories. I hear people's stories all of the time. I love hearing people's stories. And the stories of a lot of the women I know are just spellbinding. Um, and so one of my intentions is to get these women on the podcast and to do interviews with them. And I have some guests lined up for the new year. And I'm really excited to have them come on and talk about how they live their lives and what they do and how they navigate life with often like many different strands of interests, often many different careers. They're all very creative women, and they all kind of live life in the way that the status quo would have you believe. You can't. And this is coming from a woman who has steadfastly done her own thing for her whole life. So I intend and I hope for there to be some sort of really meaningful transition in that. And a sort of a transition and a transmission also. So today I had intended to talk about this during the second episode, but I lost my voice when I had the winter lurgy. So instead, you had a snippet of one of the meditations from the Emergence meditation series, which there will be a link to that in the show notes. That is a free resource for you. And when you sign up, you will receive my monthly newsletters to keep you abreast of events and things that are happening in the world of women doing their thing. So let's talk about where I have emerged from a little bit. We're going to start at the very beginning, right? So, I suppose on paper, things didn't really look so tranquil for me at the beginning, but as a child, I was actually kind of oblivious, oblivious to what was going on, and very much living an like a sort of an idyllic life on a farm with my grandparents and my mum. I grew up in Cavan, which is in the North Midlands in Ireland. Cavan would have been, still quite a small sort of rural town when I was a kid, but I would have grown up kind of in the sticks, in the back arse of nowhere, as we call it. And when I was a kid, the one vehicle on the farm was actually the tractor, which I think probably drove at, maybe 15 k's an hour or something like that. It was very, very slow. And so Granda would drive us, to church in the tractor, to town in the tractor. It was, we did get a car further on down the line. I think it was one of my mum's hand-me-downs. It was a Nissan Bluebird, I think, which was a little bit like driving in a tin can. And my granddad drove the Nissan Bluebird at exactly the same speed as he drove the tractor. I'm sure you could have given him a Formula One car and he would have driven it at the same pace as the tractor too. So my grandparents were farm owners, and this was way before farming was cool. This was like, back in the days when you got handed down a farm, like you inherited a farm because you were the man in the family, and basically you did your best. And it was, I don't think it was my grandfather's calling by any means. He was called to my grandmother. And I think given the chance, I reckon he would have been, something literary. He loved words and quoted poetry at the drop of a hat. And I think my grandmother would have wanted to be, a star of the screen or something like that. And my mum was an artist and a teacher, and she was full of wild ideas. And that was basically the backdrop to my beginning. The reason why my mum was single and why we lived with my grandparents was because because my dad had died by suicide when I was a little bit older than 2 years old. And so that kind of pulled the rug out from under any semblance of the life that my mum had kind of created for herself. She lived with I would have began my upbringing living in the west of Ireland in a town called Sligo. Um, and so after my dad's death, she moved back to live with my grandparents and sort of rise from the ashes and reform her life. Um, and so even though there was that kind of the backdrop of tragedy and grief and loss, when I was very small, I was really very much surrounded by love. And my beginning was kind of punctuated by, like, memories of soft animal fur and the feel of dough in my small hands. I would stand beside my grandmother in the kitchen and she would bake an apple pie and she would give me like a small little container for me to make my own apple pie. So I would, manipulate the dough and put in the apple filling, and I remember really strongly the smell of the range in the kitchen and the apple tart as it cooked, and Granny always seemed to be making brown soda bread. Memories of my red wellies that were always just a little bit too big with plastic bags inside to keep out the rain. Um, and there was an endless supply of colouring pencils and paper, and it was really quite tranquil. And it was only when I think I would have gone to primary school when I was about 4 or 5, and school was following that kind of surrounding and upbringing and environment. School was sort of like a rude awakening for me because it um it brought my attention to all sorts of things that hadn't been apparent to me previously. And it was really hard for me to relate because school and the education system really didn't represent my particular family constellation in any way. Um, School was sort of like where I suddenly became aware of separation. I know a lot of people, a lot of psychologists would talk about how we become aware of separation at birth. It feels like it took a little bit longer for me. Um, I remember particularly all of the stories in my English reader were about families that had like a mum and a dad and lots of siblings, and that, there was always a family dog called Spot or something like that. But I didn't get that. I got, oh, this is a story about somebody, but it in the education system, we were kind of being educated to understand this is how all families work. And for me, I was like, well, this is just has nothing to do with my particular family constellation or how my family works or what makes sense to me. The assumption that there was a man of the house. Well, there really wasn't a man in the house when I was growing up because my grandmother was the man of the house. Um, my granddad was sort of, I guess you could say, had quite modern values, and he would help cook food, and all of the roles were shared in the house that I grew up in. Of course, we were still living within that sort of patriarchal paradigm whereby my grandfather took care of the land, and we were still living within a sort of culture and society, but there were a lot of things that were really quite different that didn't add up and that weren't represented by my schooling experience. And my mum wasn't actually around that much because she spent quite a few years of my early childhood in court fighting with my dad's family. And so when she was around, she was asleep and very tired. And I think, when I look back on it now, it was very clear that there were sort of like echoes of PTSD, and she would have had long periods of depression, all because of this huge sort of rift that had happened in her life. So this girl went to school, and I think what was really interesting for me was I had this feeling of what felt good and what didn't feel good very clearly in my body. And there were lots of ways that we were treated in school which felt bad to me. Like, of course, this was Ireland in the 1980s, and my school was in a very remote part of the country, so teachers would still hit students. Just like there were all sorts of like outlandish and awful punishments that kids were put through. And I had been brought up by a very religious grandmother, grandfather not so much so, but my grandmother was very, very religious, and she taught me these values like kindness and respect, that kind of knew no boundaries. There was no hierarchy to kindness and respect in the way that she taught me about them. And so I went to school, and it was a religious school, but I couldn't see the echoes of what my granny had taught me in school. I saw a lot this kind of cultivation of fear in students, and I saw a lot the hierarchy, and I saw a lot of this expectation that we would be obedient just for the sake of obedience because somehow the teacher was kind of better. I don't know, in charge, something like that. And I had this really strange and difficult time trying to, what's the word? Place both of these paradigms that I was living in. Because on one hand, I had such unerring faith in my grandmother's wisdom, and on the other, I was being sent to school to learn these things that felt like they were removing me from myself and my kindness and my generosity. I think for a small child to have that experience, they start to believe, well, this thing mustn't be true and this must be true. So if everybody in school is telling me that this is how you need to behave and this is how life's meant to be, well, I suppose that this is true and the stuff that my granny is telling me about isn't true. And so from a very young age, I had this kind of quest for truth. And also from a very young age, I had these unusual, what you could call spiritual experiences. Maybe you could call them peak experiences. I had these experiences that opened me to the mystical aspects of life that nobody really talked about, but that I would in time discover paths towards. I mean, I was pretty young when I started reading about Timothy Leary. I think I was about 10 when I discovered a book about him, and it was through him that I started reading Richard Alpert Ramdas. I got really interested in Buddhism at a very young age. I grew up in a family where God and religion were kind of like stuck on the level of there was something sort of transactional about it. Like in my granny's words, everything belonged to God. It was God's light that kind of opened up in the morning time. It was God's sky at night. It was God's stars and moon. And my granny's attitude was, if we are good, we receive good things in return. And so by being this kid that became aware of cruelty once I went to school, this cruelty and separation, I really kind of started to question that perception of God. I had this feeling of like, well, if that's all that God's about, I don't think that God's around for me. But I started to seek out that which represented goodness to me. I would very often, when I came home from school, I would very often spend time sitting outside on the farm with the dog. We had this gorgeous old black Labrador type dog called Beauty. Beauty had 3 legs because something had happened to one of them in an accident out on the road. Beauty had 3 legs. She was just around forever. And I would sit outside with the dog, and I would sit like, I have this really strong recollection of sitting on a tree stump in the back garden. And this is one particular memory that really stands out for me, because I was sitting out there with Beauty and Towser, another dog that we had. Towser was my mum's dog. And it had been a really hard day at school, and I was really like very much in questioning mode, and very much in this feeling of like, this isn't fair. The way that this school thing is going isn't fair, and it doesn't fit with how I've been brought up, and I just don't understand it. And I couldn't understand why the teacher was so mean to me, and I couldn't understand why I was just so different to my classmates, and I was very confused and frustrated, and like in this really kind of tricky little place for a kid to manage. Like I would have been about 5 or 6 or something like that. I remember just sitting outside in nature and having this sense of, and I can feel perfectly fine at the same time as all of this other stuff is passing me by, as long as I can have conditions like the fresh air on my skin and the feeling of, I can still remember the oily coat of Beauty and the wiry coat of Towser, and this feeling of being safe and contained once I'm surrounded by these, by these trees. And I didn't know what I was doing back then, but this is actually one of the things that's central to organic intelligence. I was orientated to my environment, and it was easy for me to see things as they were because I felt safe, because there was something about those conditions that helped my system decompress from the stress of the day. And I always felt safe, in my grandmother's home. That was like an environment that just felt very contained, calm, accepting. But then you switch to school, where there was a lot of chaos and a lot of unpredictable behaviour from teachers, and that was a little bit too much for my system to handle. I couldn't deal with that level of unpredictability. So from a very young age, I was kind of tapped into something else. I think that this is particularly interesting because my mum was actually incredibly spiritual. She moved away from the church, and she didn't really have very much time for Christianity. Not in a sort of like formal religious kind of way, maybe in a more mystical way. She would have been interested in it. But she was very spiritual, and allegedly my dad had intended to become a priest until he met my mum. So there's kind of no surprise to me that I've ended up being quite a spiritually and mystically curious being. This brings us to like just a slight kind of conversation about organic intelligence and what it is and what it means. Organic intelligence, like the intention behind organic intelligence, is basically to bring us back to our wholeness, to our untapped capacity for healing. And we all have these moments where healing and where life makes so much sense. And what organic intelligence suggests is that we're more of that than the other. We're more of that wholeness and well-being than we are the negativity bias and the sort of machinations of our survival programming. And of course we're both, but one leads to growth and the other leads to a sort of stuckness, stasis. Maybe, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but what we're wanting to cultivate is that which leads us on the path of growth. We're wanting to cultivate the thing that brings us closer to the light, and that's everything. That is what I'm all about. A few years ago, I also went back to school to train to become a psychotherapist. I had been going to psychotherapy from quite a young age. And I wouldn't have realised at the time, but the therapists that I had been going to, and this maybe says a little bit more about like the culture around psychotherapy at the time when I'd started going there, but the psychotherapists that I had been going to were a lot influenced by Jung. There would have been a lot of influence by, like Fritz Perls and Gestalt. And also Carl Rogers, one of my favourite psychologists of all time. And actually, when I studied, there has been like a big movement in the field towards cognitive behavioural techniques. And when I studied, I signed up for a degree during lockdown. It was like pretty much the beginning of the pandemic, and I signed up for a degree then. And the degree was in large part Rogerian, but also there was this huge chunk of it which was Glasserian. Glasser created what's now called choice theory, which is based on reality theory. Reality theory, I mean. The interesting thing about that is, on one hand, Rogers speaks to everything that I've been experiencing throughout my whole life, this person-centered approach, this readiness to accept what is emerging from our systems, that we're always moving in the direction of growth and wholeness and healing. And then on the other hand, my experience of working with Glasser was really uninspiring for me, because I have always been attracted to approaches that speak to my soul. And Glasserian approach, the Glasserian approach just didn't speak in any way to my soul, and felt like it was sort of removed and over intellectual, and made like it implied that choice is something that's a purely cognitive construct, whereas by that time I'd already been studying organic intelligence, and what I discovered through organic intelligence was that choice becomes much easier to make once we're living in a regulated, orientated system. Choice arises and emerges and kind of sets us on the right path in the right way. So now I am an organic intelligence coach and psychotherapist, and that's kind of a little bit of the story of my beginning and where I came from. And I intend to continue with this a little bit more in the next part of the podcast 4. Right here, right now in the Northern Hemisphere, as I mentioned earlier, it is solstice. Solstice, the time of turning. And so maybe just as we leave here today, I thought it would be nice to reflect on a couple of little things. We are light liberators, and we're protectors of the peace. And there are all of these moments throughout the year where we have this opportunity to take stock and reflect and appreciate. I'm not a person who's particularly interested in making New Year's resolutions. I'm not a person who feels like I need to start January as a new person and kind of like hammer myself into some sort of new kind of union. I take these opportunities to take stock probably almost daily, just because of the life that I live. But solstice is a really beautiful time to pay attention, to notice what has been. And the gift of this turning and the slowing and the darkness brings us to the subsequent emergence of light. And a question that I'd like to leave you with today is, what's ready to happen? What's ready to happen? What is ready to happen? Thank you for listening, my loves. Until next time.